Data reveals ever more complex forces at work that it seems we must somehow problem solve our way through or contain. A lot of theorists like Joseph Tainter, writing about collapse in complex societies, reject environmental determinism while theorizing that extreme complexity is a weight that few societies can comfortably bear. I wonder if the problem per se is complexity itself or the hardening of social behaviors that is our response to the sense that complexity will overwhelm us. This thought occurred to me as I was reviewing the zombie ideas we've seen so far. And I realized that every idea presented by our speakers seeks to open space for new approaches or establish more flexible rubrics to resist such a hardening of ideas and practices within our complex world. So far in the conversations, the two registers most strongly evident are one, a desire to shift from management to care, to alter the terms of engagement in design, planning, and research in ways that account for not quantitative capacities, under-accounted for senses, and spiritual and emotional understandings. And second, a desire to revamp our understanding of time and socio-environmental processes, mostly to extend timeframes beyond the demands for efficiency that we take for granted. Interestingly, Tainter sees demands for efficiency as one of the root causes of escalating complexity. A number of speakers also have contested epistemological assumptions, and it should be no surprise that our underlying beliefs, those that spur us ever deeper into wherever we are now, probably need an overhaul. Tonight's speakers will present their own zombie ideas, and in one way or another, they all set out to undermine absolute authorities. They will all be debunking the singular voice of mastery, history as fact, the singular vantage point of professionalized science, and the seemingly necessary apparatus of extractive industries, all in order to restructure the way we know the world so that we may see opportunities to open space for new approaches and establish more flexible practices. I want to welcome and thank them for presenting and participating in tonight's conversation. You can find all of their bios online, so we're not going to fill time by recounting them here. Finally, welcome to everyone who's logged on. Please be aware that we're recording this, and we have put the link for the recording of last week's conversation in the chat for anyone who missed it. So we're going to start tonight with Julia Czerniak.
Great. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm assuming you see it?
Yep.
Okay, great. So thank you for the invitation. So the zombie idea I'm challenging tonight is the master plan, which for me caught my attention back in 1989 when I was in graduate school, when the North Carolina Museum of Art team challenged it in this issue of Assemblage. And they said the master plan, with all of its, quote, attendant associations, an overarching, distant, perfectly realized and finished plan, admitting no dissent, no contingency, is rejected. Surprisingly, it still exists. Citing the influential work of Rem Koolhaas, Bernard Tschumi, that came before him, the team substituted an open-ended series of planning scenarios for the traditional master plan. I don't know why it's not advancing. Hold on. Oh, there we go. Sorry. So in their theory, we see some interesting phrases like disperse univocality, anticipate change, or things with no end in sight, phrases that we've become accustomed to. And in their planning scenarios, they advanced basically zoning the site in highly interpretable ways. That was over 30 years ago. More recently, the emergence of its close cousin, the framework plan, makes strides in building flexible visions, yet fails to reimagine the regulatory, financial, and community building structures that would enable truly open and inclusive planning scenarios. So using the city of Syracuse and Syracuse University's past 8-year collaboration as a case study, I want to share what I think are some innovative public and private frameworks, some inventive funding alignments, and design strategies that are based on notions of the incremental that I think might just open up inclusive and flexible ways of working. So our past president, Nancy Cantor, had this strong belief in universities as public goods, as anchor institutions in our communities, which galvanized expertise and expanded our disciplines. And in doing so, prepared our students, in and for the work in the world. The frameworks, these constructed sort of mega communities, she argues, are exactly what we need today when our city here, Syracuse, like so many others, still struggle with the effects of disinvestment. There's also a strong belief that revitalization will be evident in more than the visible improvements of the city, which challenges us to make the most of what sociologist Saskia Sassen had called our cityness, or the intersection of differences that's the very foundation of urbanity. So at Syracuse, this strategy for collaboration is called Scholarship in Action, which was a commitment to forge bold, imaginative, and sustained engagements with communities of experts, which are everyone from scholars to professionals to the citizens of our city, who basically bring their way of seeing and valuing the world to the table. So this is an ambitious call for nothing less than to build what Susan Sturm, who's a professional in law at Columbia, calls an architecture of inclusion, designing and giving substance to the kind of communities and democratic culture that befit a diverse community. So at Syracuse, the chancellor's ambitions were to construct what she called the equivalent of civil infrastructure, which are large-scale sustainable projects that merit substantial institutional investment. And I'm not just speaking here of finances, I'm talking of time and energy and commitment as a kind of investment. And these are some of the project's characteristics and ambitions. I mean, they're large, they were complex, they engaged faculty and students. They changed how our city functions. And then there were some more lofty ones, like the last one you see there about removing barriers that are both real and symbolic that obscure hope. So with this in mind, I'm going to share a glimpse at two projects or two aspects of projects that use inventive funding and then advanced strategies of incremental design, which start to challenge master plans ways of thinking. And the first is for the Near West Side, which is we call it a plan, but it's not a plan at all, but a kind of a menu of interventions in 5 categories that guide reinvestment. And the numbers you see on the image on the right are the different interventions. And the neighborhood, which is surrounded there with the white line, is typical of many legacy cities. It's a disenfranchised area that nonetheless has a kind of remarkable assets and infrastructure. There have been a lot of efforts in the neighborhood over this years, from for the infill of a kind of a historic fabric density with affordable green houses, to a local artist reclaiming infrastructure here in a series called Love Letters to Syracuse, to a local student-driven kind of playscape for one of the neighborhood schools. However, the most important thing to mention here, kind of the circumstance that enabled us to propose strategies that I'm calling hybridize the infrastructure with the civic, is clear in this map. And the Near West Side, which you see in red, is located in a sewer shed, which you see in blue, that makes it eligible for federal funds associated with green improvement. So stormwater mitigation funding, as you probably know, rarely foregrounds civic benefits that activated urban life, but our thinking was to combine something we could not afford, the civic, with a kind of ecological role that we could find money for in kind of small packages that could be repeated. So for example, this was one of them. We designed a cast in place concrete containment that doubled as tree pits and infiltration sites, and runnels collected the water into a kind of recycled rain feature. But really the innovation here is like the simple extension of the basin's pour serves a kind of foundation for seating made of molded plywood, kind of integrating furnishing with the engineered system and foregrounding infrastructure. Obviously, these sorts of installations are remarkably unremarkable, but their incremental realization enables us to respond to needs, desires, and resources. I mean, I think most importantly, part of our work here was to establish a Near West Side advisory board whose mission was to work in partnership with the community long after the designers and the university leaves, which we have. And if it weren't for working with residents like Mary Alice Smothers, incredible active member, here she's being interviewed by one of the Syracuse architecture students in a project, we wouldn't have known many things. We wouldn't have known how many residents dislike street trees because they index disinvestment. And such information, I think, catalyzed some very innovative work. So that second little thing I want to show is the connective corridor, kind of never-ending project. This is this competition scheme. It's a 2-mile streetscape that links the University on the Hill with downtown, and all the little yellow buildings are the kind of cultural institutions. The project has gone through many, many changes. This is kind of the way it was built. But the designers were focused not only on linkage, but producing an identity to a new part of the city. So our proposal was based on the notion that the success of the corridor over time is contingent on its design as a legible and resilient system, able to absorb design initiatives by others while retaining its identity. So how? Two things I'll share is the first is that we developed a kind of system, a matrix of choices that ensure consistency yet change. And also through the cleverness of Pentagram, who saw use in the word Syracuse, a series of kind of promotional items that could be on the corridor before it was actually emerged in design. And secondly, we developed what I call a color spectrum, a kind of working spectrum that allows there to be a kind of boldness of red in certain parts of the roofs on the elements that are used, and a kind of comfort of rust in the others, depending upon the context to which it passes. So this work really came to, we came to the tactic of accumulation. And this is based on urban theorist Roger Sherman, what he calls radical incrementalism, which is a design strategy that utilizes accumulation as a means of producing character and identity across an urban field in lieu of master planning. And this is an image from his writing that suggests this idea of accumulation. And this is bike parking near Amsterdam Central Station. But for us, it was the repetition of one color in the color spectrum red in the scheme as a way of producing identity and coherence while being open to vastly different needs and desires. So I'll stop there. And I'll unshare my screen. How was my time, Denise?
It was fine, thank you.
Okay.
I did not feel inclined to mute you.
Good. So how do I unshare? Oh, stop share. Okay, there.
Yeah. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce Matthew Seibert. He's up next.
Okay, I'll set up my screen here. So first I want to thank, obviously, Denise and Spitzer School of Architecture for having me. Appreciate it. I also want to sort of preface this. This is a project in collaboration with Christy Sherman of Ohio State University. And so our work was originally about confronting the inherent dilemma that comes with the decision to engage with river landscapes, and especially to modify them in an attempt to sort of gain control. And the goal of this work was to use historical inquiry as a tool to reconsider a broader definition of potential landscape futures, one in which infrastructure, flood control infrastructure specifically in this case, is imbued with far greater capacity to act in time and space, and with the definition of security that is far more inclusive and much more ambitious. But as we'll see with this investigation, it brought much more sort of thorny questions kind of concerning the definition of history itself and the design ethics of kind of engaging with history as a medium. And so the idea I'm challenging is history as an absolute, as a sort of a type of objective knowledge, a sort of ever or solid and ever expanding discourse developing along kind of generally accepted trajectories. Whoops. And so histories, they're lost all the time. They're changed, misremembered, even rewritten, which means that the experience of history often contains a surprising amount of fiction. as a proxy for lost history and a critique of the decision-making surrounding the restructuring of the American landscape following the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. This parafictional project, the Office of Recovery and Reconciliation, acts as temporary geographies for erased, forgotten, or unfulfilled spatial trajectories. And so the project examines the histories made possible by incomplete evidence and constructs the landscapes that emerge from unresolved debates surrounding infrastructure of futures. So what follows really raises questions about the malleability of history, about the capacity of flood control infrastructure to ever truly secure, and about the ability of an institutional archive to carry the conflicting histories, memories, and experiences that are inevitably altered as we seek to control natural systems. And so while the spectacular constructions of flood control infrastructure give the outward appearance of security and control, they do so by establishing boundaries with forces and systems that don't always play by the same rules. And so that slippage between perceived security and almost guaranteed disruption is what we find fascinating, productive moment in ongoing negotiation with natural systems. And so our work begins with those moments when the river breaches the contract, creating a punctuation in any sense of a benign equilibrium. Our work makes the assumption that punctuations are inevitable and always followed by critical moments of design decision-making. So in short, we're sort of interested in the aftermath. And so we work with artifacts that emerge in the aftermath of flood events. Our interest lies in understanding where and how these infrastructures begin to sort of register kind of landscape fear and how it's archived and begins to sort of shape the landscape. And so these archival documents create historical footholds and an incomplete story about the designed relationship between infrastructure and landscapes. And so even the most well-intentioned efforts to secure, control, or resist come with a host of socio-ecological consequences, including erasures, as you can see in these USDA or USGS maps from 1940 and 2010. Decisions are made, lines are drawn, space, material, memory, and people are shuffled. And so this, and this kind of takes a number of different forms. For instance, this cemetery was originally in a previous location that was erased due to kind of the construction of the flood control infrastructure. And so regardless of speed, it leaves behind a landscape both defined by kind of disruption and security. And so there's a persistent tension between unwieldy environmental dynamics and the need to secure against change, and a dialectical relationship between the inevitability of disruption and the mandates for security, both of which we argue produce acts of erasure. And so no actors, agents, or organizations kind of make this more apparent than the Army Corps. They gave rise to some of the country's most spectacular constructions. And it was essentially an arms race with the Mississippi River. So over decades of kind of speeding up and slowing down environmental forces across 1/3 of the US, the Corps unwittingly assumed the position of kind of most powerful and contested landscape designer in US history. And so as design researchers, we have gone back to critical moments of scenario planning in Corps history to understand and deconstruct these complex decision-making processes as a tool to consider potential alternate futures. And the Corps ideology, or the Corps' ideology of controlling the natural world, it worked in a number of ways, from sort of federal government extending national control with legislation, essentially employing the Corps as flood guardians in a landscape of punctuated equilibrium. And so the future can be secured by using American democratic instruments to lay the legal groundwork for what essentially is brute engineering. And so this almost entirely manifested itself in what's called the levees only policy, where the Mississippi River would be controlled simply by constraining it to a single path. And this was for several reasons, but principally it was because the levees only policy was tangible, translatable, and politically palatable. Bigger, wider, taller was the motto. But that turned out to be wildly and lethally inaccurate. The most destructive river flood in the history of the US in 1927 broke the levee in 145 places, 27,000 square miles were inundated, 700,000 people were homeless, and the estimated cost of damage was up to $1 billion, which sort of computing backwards was essentially 1/3 of the federal budget in 1927. And so the river had spoken. Levees alone would not work. What emerged in the years sort of following this was really a flurry of experimentation, legislation, and perhaps most significantly, a renewed commitment to the capacity of infrastructure to prevent loss. And so this set in motion a drastic recalibration of the Corps' identity, radically transforming its roles and actively shaping the American landscape. And a new landscape infrastructure type finally gained the necessary political will to become a viable part of the Corps' arsenal, and that's the spillway. And so even though the levee had become the icon of protection for the lower Mississippi Basin, the spillway offered engineers the art and flexibility of directional control. And so along the boutique project of the Corps, the spillway allowed for greater flexibility and introduced a level of tolerable indeterminacy into the planning process, but also required massive expanses of floodable land. And so while some engineers kind of worked on what spillway was, others worked on where it will be built, and what has to be moved to make room for it. And so what we're looking at is this land evaluation map that begins to sort of catalog land values based on people living there, land use, et cetera. And this process, obviously created a lot of anxiety. This land valuation, we're assigning dollar figures to occupied land. It really depends on obviously what's there with the people kind of having a deep connection to place. And so there's evidence of the communities actually expressing this anxiety, but nonetheless, they proceeded, leaving behind a vast, if not always, sort of equitable paper trail. And in a matter of 2 decades, Lower Basin was transformed into a machined landscape, defined really as much by its inauthenticity as by its realness. And so this leads to the parafiction, which in many ways is also sort of the beginning of the project. And so in the process of researching the spillway, this highly contested infrastructure type, we visited the archives at the Army Corps of Engineers district headquarters in New Orleans. And as often happens in archives, we found an all but forgotten cache of evidence, construction documents of control structures, documentation of near catastrophic compromising of these structures, correspondence, etc. But perhaps the most revelatory discovery were documents pertaining to a small radical office, which was called the Office of Recovery and Reconciliation. And this office formed in 1928 to manage cultural restitution for the Army Corps and preservation of local heritage in the aftermath of the flood. Founding documents, correspondence, drawings reveal a whole additional side to the Corps, a side sensitive to the cultural underpinnings of place, the essential influence of memory, and a radically unique take on what flood control infrastructure can be. And remarkably, amid an atmosphere of sort of outwardly assured technological supremacy, the lost documents of the Office of Recovery and Reconciliation really reveal an institution divided over how to manage floods and the national anxieties that accompany them. So, this reveals them as being sort of one willing to wrestle with the costs of its unprecedented reach for power and control. And so this office operates as a proxy for lost history and a critique of the decision-making surrounding the restructuring of the American landscape in the early 20th century. And so what remains of these documents and their associated narratives manifests temporary geographies for erased, forgotten, or unfulfilled spatial trajectories of the Corps. And so positioned at the slippage between documented truths, unfinished business, and mythic tales, these materials dissolve obvious markers of past and present, found and fabricated, and expose an institution's quixotic desire for permanence in the face of constant change. So full of unmapped gaps and spatial aberrations, the documents construct this mythic topology of competing histories and counterfactual possibilities for the lower Mississippi Basin. And all of the documents discussed are in some way real in the sense that they exist as physical material objects worthy of consideration. These objects, some extracted from historical contexts, others constructed out of context, work collectively as a critique of our histories kept, lost, and forgotten. And so we, the authors, see design as a tool to project both forward and backward in time, to work on the formation and decay of space, and to explore the socio-technical imaginaries that shape our landscape. And so this results in a new landscape methodology, one that we call parafictional design research, where it splices future-oriented scenario building with grounded, rigorous archival research. And ultimately, this instrumentalizes design beyond the conventions of both projected proposals and historical research into a territory where history and the writing of history, disciplines fundamental to the formation and evolution of social ideas, realities and imaginaries, is now a medium to interrogate through the eidetic tools and techniques of design. And though it certainly walks a fine line, particularly in the past 4 years of post-truth darkness, the reflections, conversations, and questions it raises through historical fiction are acute in their strength to empower individuals and advocate for change in a time of unprecedented turmoil. Thank you.
Denise, you're muted.
Thank you. Thanks for unsharing. That's what I asked Matthew. And Liz Berry, we'll have you up next.
Thanks, everyone. Let me try to share the screen. Great. Can you see my slides?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thanks. Well, to start with, I'm really grateful for these arguments by the co-panelists this evening, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. And I also have to thank you, Denise, for the invitation to share in this Everyday Ecology series. So my name is Liz Berry, and my academic background is in landscape architecture and urban design. And tonight, the idea I'm here to kill is that belief in science is what's needed for justice or even survival. I know, whoa, like, don't give any ground to fascism. Not this week. This is not the year, but here we are. So consider hearing me out. More precisely, I'm saying that regulatory science and the pursuit of human rights in a democracy can get in each other's way, and that environmental health in the form of concentrated personal exposures and the way that these exposures have grown to planetary scale demonstrate the effects of this interference. So first, let's take a look at how the effects of this interference are already visible at scale. Let's look at 2 mass mobilizations about science, full of people fully mobilized around climate change, but who are not actually pulling together. So Washington, DC, January 2017, the start of the Trump administration, over 100,000 people turned out for the March for Science. Worldwide, 1 million people estimated participation. The March for Science is one of the many kind of retrenching efforts that spun up to reestablish science's position in elite governance and to call for evidence-based policy, doubling down on expertise as a source of authority. This messaging demands your belief in science. Now, 3 years earlier, more than 300,000 people had joined the People's Climate March in New York City. This is widely regarded as the largest climate march in history, with an estimated 600,000 participating worldwide. They marched against pipelines and for legislative actions, and to reduce the harm of climate change impacts that disproportionately affect frontline communities, for a just transition. So there's no doubt in this group of marchers that climate change is real. There's no doubt in science. There's no lack of belief, because they or people they know live near where fossil fuels were first pulled out of the ground, transported, and refined. So superficially, these events look similar, but when we look closer, we see 2 very different populations, both science-oriented, but with different relationships to power. And I want to just make a note on the shift in language when talking about pollution as a specific localized event to talking about climate change as a planetary phenomenon. And for the purposes of this discussion, I'd like to establish 3 points. 1, that the applications of modern science created pollution. Read Jasanoff and Liberon on this. 2, that pollution is knowable by modern science. And 3, that modern science-based policy, we in the US, we created the gold standard, even though we may no longer have the gold standard here, have failed to hold the biggest criminals of the fossil fuel industry accountable when their wrongs were merely at the scale of pollution, where people were getting sick from toxic exposure and the system didn't stop it. Now the problem is planetary. My case studies are from four sites in the United States where people are going outside to ask questions about their environment, trying to figure out what's going on with their rivers or their health, and learning how to manage the human environment relationship in different, hopefully better ways. These are the first type of data we're going to look at is the simple photograph. And for use of photographs, I'd like to give this first trophy to the most straightforward image sequence to the Gowanus Dredgers Boat Club, the Gowanus Canal Conservancy, with an assist credit to Adon Rotenberg from the Super Law Group. So I'm not talking about any of this inquiry, this terrain of inquiry that I'm showing right now. I'm not talking about the summertime dye tracing to see where the canal's current might allow for sandbars to be reconstructed or wetlands to be replanted. I'm not talking about the wintertime ice canoeing where you can see previously unknown chemical leaks that are melting their way through the ice. I'm not talking about the New York City water trail collecting bacterial samples that, in combination with the failed water treatment during Hurricane Sandy, eventually led up to telling the EPA, to successfully getting the EPA to increase their Superfund boundary for restoration. No, we're just gonna talk about some photos. Because while people were out there doing all of that investigation, they also just took pictures of other stuff going on in the neighborhood, like this employee hosing off a diesel truck. They kept taking photos. Oh, the water came off the truck. Oh, water flows downhill. Real easy to prove that one in court. And into the waters of the United States. This did it. This caught the attention of the US Attorney's Office, Eastern District, who then looked more closely into many aspects of this company's rather sloppy operations and eventually prosecuted them under stronger charges. The best one and done image is going to go to healthygulf.org and Scott Eustace, an intrepid wetland scientist on the United Bulk Pet Coke export terminal on the Mississippi River. And, but to be sure, I'm not talking about this terrain of inquiry that was going on. I'm not talking about making your own infrared cameras. I'm not talking about using blue lasers to type different types of oil, fingerprinting where a spill might have come from. I'm not talking about flying cameras in old soda bottles or building browser-based software to stitch your images into maps. I'm just talking about this photo. The sheriff had just arrived. The plant said there were Russians standing on the levee. Anyways, they had to pull their kite down. And as it swung, the camera snapped this picture underneath the conveyor belt, showing the steepness of the pile of coal. That met the legal definition of ongoing pollution and convincing that the agency, which, because it was politically unpopular to act, hadn't acted until civil society showed them they had enough evidence to sue, which is quite a lot of environmental advocacy. And so this went up to federal lawsuit and consent decree. Moving on to the third type, and kind of building on this progression, image photographs, sequences of photographs, photographs taken from the air, photographs now made into maps and even models. And so the trophy for the best volume calculation for aerial imagery goes to Olga Batista and the Southeast Side Coalition to Ban Pet Coke at the Calumet River, Chicago, Illinois. But this terrain of inquiry didn't matter. It didn't matter that people went over to Civic Hackers Chicago Hack Night, who rigged up APIs from the weather reports, both speed and direction, to trigger text alerts to the neighborhood to let them know when the wind was going to be blowing byproduct from the Alberta tar sands onto their pets, their children, and their food. It didn't matter that we took photos from boats, from kites, from so many different sides of this piles, that we created not only geo-referenced maps, but used a structure for motion, open source protocol to derive the actual volume of these piles. It didn't matter because there wasn't even regulation for the size of these piles. This was unregulated hazardous waste condition. This was a Koch brothers property. And all the community organizing, just background. It was this one photo where we're looking now at the Koch brothers property into this hellscape. And what matters is that the freshly fallen snow is covered with the same color particle that had clearly been blown off their property lines. That, well, plus some direct action mobilizations in front of City Hall, created policy where there was none. Oh, and those piles, yeah, they're gone. They moved across state lines to Indiana. So lastly, I'm gonna talk about collecting physical samples of air, water, or soil. You can sign affidavits to say, I took these samples, and then the lab can testify on their authority about what's in them. And so this biggest trophy, I mean, $30 million deserves a big trophy, right? It's only the second ever successful prosecution under the Clean Air Act and the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. Let me say that again. This is only the second time that there was success in a federal criminal case under the Clean Air Act. And this goes to Jackie James and Citizen Science Community Resources against Tonawanda Koch, New York. I want to point out that there's a bucket from Global Community Monitor shown at left, that's Jackie. There's a vacuum cleaner that pulls out the air in the bucket, causing the sterilized lab bag to expand, pulling in a sample of air. At the lower, we can see that this project eventually resulted in documenting 75 times higher benzene proportions. And yes, this splash page on justice.gov is rewarding, but the terrain of inquiry I want to show you here happens over a timescape. So 16 years from when people first observed health symptoms to taking a sample, to talk to the state agency, to set up 3 monitors for a year, so that then they could, they got journalistic coverage, and then applied to EPA for an additional 1-year study with 4 monitors this time. Finally, barricading the factory gates, the Department of Justice comes in with search warrants, and the plant manager is taken away in handcuffs. Did I mention $30 million? This all is very difficult to do. And it's compounded by the fact that there's a fundamental lack of respect for all people, meaning that it takes this kind of direct action. So not only terrains of inquiry, and then specific smoking gun environmental evidence, but also putting bodies on the line. And I want to say it's because science, data is not winning these fights. These are political fights. And if you can just imagine, everything shown here in red are the kinds of data that are not taken into account. Now imagine all the other ways of knowing the world that do not count under this epistocracy.
That's a great place to close, Liz, and we can pick up the rest in question and answer.
Thank you.
All right, if you can unshare, our final presentation tonight is Maria Duran Callisto, and her, I paired Liz Berry and Ana Maria because they're both interested in the epistocracy. Go ahead.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm going to share my screen, and I'll try to be as fast as possible, which is always challenging for me. Oops, sorry. Where am I? Should have had this open already. Thought I did. Present. Okay. I titled this mini lecture, The Ecologies of Others, which is actually the title of a book by an anthropologist called Philippe Descola, who has spent a large part of his research life in Ecuadorian Amazonia, working with a tribe. And I love that notion of the ecologies of others. The zombie I have been wanting to kill, and I just copied what I sent you, Denise, is extractivism. And by extractivism in Latin America, we mean something very different from extraction. Extraction can be benign. Amazonians extract from the forest without destroying it. Extractivism is a different matter. It's take everything without giving anything back. With its epistocracy, to link myself to Liz, of international development based on the imposition of expert-driven, and here I must digress a little bit, the international policy of the US very often is the national policy of Latin American countries, extractivist and agro-industrial economic models. I propose a reverse colonization in which the West within abandons its hubris and humbly learns from the East within. And by the East within, I refer to Native America, the original nations of the Americas, First Nations, indigenous peoples, what have you. The zombie I would like to inoculate is a ñaupa, a Quechua concept that the indigenous movement in Ecuador uses to discuss how to address its ancestral past as it ponders on its future. Ñaupa can refer both to the past and the future, and its time in movement. And the reason why I want to do this is this reverse colonization is because the original nations of what we now refer to as America lived in territorial cities, veritable urban agroecologies, as I will show you. We have much to learn from them, so let us be colonized by them. That's what I hope to achieve today. And this stemmed from the fact that at some point in my life, it was 2014, 2015, I was doing three things simultaneously that I think just triangulated and affected each other. Over a coffee, Gary had invited me to participate in curating this book. So I was looking at case studies of what was, ecological urbanism in Latin America, but I was simultaneously reading a lot the books written by archaeologists of the region, and the Amazonian archaeology is fascinating, and it has advanced immensely thanks to LiDAR since the 80s. Anya Curtenius Roosevelt is one of those turning points within the perception of ancient Amazonia. But as I was doing these two things, and these were just like the case studies that I kept piling up all over Latin America and trying to understand what we meant by an ecological urbanism. But the debate that emerged as we were curating this book is that the idea came about that Latin American students were coming to universities in the US to learn about ecological urbanism, and then they were going back and transforming their places. And I thought that was a very awkward argument. I was like, there's something really wrong and very colonial about this argument. How is it possible that, the people whose ancestors built Machu Picchu are learning now ecological urbanism from an episteme that has nothing to do with it? Americans, and I mean deep ancestral Americans, have been building urban ecologies for thousands of years. That was my intuition, that was my sense, because I am very aware of the fact that there's a very different ontology of the city, of architecture, of infrastructure, and of landscaping in the Americas that is expressed beautifully in Machu Picchu. So I started writing a book, a chapter initially for the book, but it was not included. It was too long, and it was probably challenging that notion too much. But I titled it Urban Ecology, and now I would call it Urban Agroecology in Latin America, an ancestral practice. And I started investigating very many case studies that I'm going to show you afterwards of pre-Columbian territorial cities. But in a way, the reason why I've been looking back into the deep past of the Americas in search for answers is because I haven't been finding the answers, to be honest with you, in the North and in the West. What the legacy of the development patterns of the North and the West is this, in the case of my country, oil fields in the rainforest that have been incredibly polluting. I mean, if we, I like that relationship that Liz made between pollution and now we call it climate change. But I think that Amazonia has been experiencing climate change since the 70s. And what the legacy of this development model is basically a social and environmental disaster. I would say that it's an ecocide, epistemicide, and genocide. And the negative externalities that we have to bear are immense. Are there benefits? Of course. Billions of dollars are involved in these industries. The corporations, whether public, private, or a hybrid thereof, are making the bulk of money, probably billions and trillions of dollars. And the nation states are making a lot too. Centralized wealth, huge corruption, and who takes care of the negative externalities? No one. Unfortunately, in our case, the Texaco Chevron lawsuit never prospered into anything positive. And this I added at the last minute for you, Liz. And there you have, Nemonte Nenquimo, who was recently included among the 100 most influential individuals by Time magazine in the world, is a Waurani who basically, comes from this legacy of Amazonian peoples who have been flying, who have been, I'm sorry, that's not the word in English, flitting, is that the word? From, this type of incredible contamination, expropriation, and genocide in Amazonia, and it's going on. So you have fossil fuels, natural gas, oil being extracted there. You have the issue of mining. These pictures are very recent, unfortunately, and this is under the quote-unquote socialist government of Rafael Correa, who basically has created concessions for mining in immense tracts of the country. And this is what we're facing right now with the mining and all the contamination that the mercury implies in this case, because it's about gold. And of course, you have the pattern in Brazil, which is, as Amazonia Sociedade Anónima documentary, I recommend you to watch, Brazilian documentary, as it explains very clearly. It's about all the layers of incentive that you have to deforest in Amazonia. You invade the land. First, you have the lumber, then you have the cattle, you sell meat, then you somehow, through bribing, get your lands legitimated by the law, and then you can sell them. And land speculation is ravaging there, and the incentives to deforest, as we saw in the recent fires, are ginormous. Even more so now with the war, the trade war between the US and China, that has basically transferred not all of it, but much of the demand of soybeans from the US to the Brazilian and the Bolivian rainforests. And on the other hand, looking for hope and looking for answers are gone, as I told you, to the deep past. And this is where archaeologists are teaching us that Amazonia was not these terra nullius with just some sparse tribes of nomads who were running around in the forest and who were just, as the naturalists always describe them, and as anthropology and ethnography initially described them, just, one more mammal in the landscape, just part of the naturalist, or even the romantic, in the case of the buen salvaje, the noble savage, just part of these untouched, pristine nature. But what archaeologists are realizing is that Amazonia is a highly anthropogenic territory, and that much of this biodiversity we actually owe to the peoples who lived there. And they lived in settlements that, in the Xingu, as Heckenberger is arguing, you had settlements that reached 250 to 350,000 people. I mean, these are not small settlements that we're discussing. And very many people will question the use of the word city when you talk about these urbanisms, because this is a very different ontology from the Western ontology. And it doesn't match that idea that we've inherited through the Neolithic revolution and the urban revolution concept that we've inherited from Mesopotamia and the Greco-Roman Empire, of the cellular city that is very often walled, surrounded by an agricultural hinterland, and eventually by the forest. This is a very different pattern, like Machu Picchu, in which agroecology, I won't call it agriculture because it's a different ontology of agriculture as well. So where you have an agroecology that is completely enmeshed with a territorial pattern of settlement and inhabitation, and with infrastructures that are both urban and agricultural in scale. But you see this type of patterns, you know, they vary in form, but these ones, for example, are the camisones, the rice fields in Bolivia, in the Beni in Bolivia, that have been documented by Clark Erickson and many others. But I need you to understand the scale of this. I mean, this is not minor. This is huge. And the ecologists are mapping, and I'm very intrigued by these productive landscapes that the Amazonians constructed. They were terraformers. They were great. Some archaeologists described them as geoengineers, bioengineers, but I think that the word engineering is not appropriate for the ontology of Amazonians. Maybe we should talk in terms of geopoetics, biopoetics, ecopoetics, because these were spiritual productive landscapes. They were enchanted in very many ways, and we can't forget that. This is not about nature as natural resource or commodity. This is sacred nature that animistic peoples deeply respect. And you start seeing at this scale, get a sense of the scale, the patterns of inhabitation just in Amazonia. But the more I got into Amazonia, and these are Clark Erickson's theories about how they had fish weirs and, you know, would manage the flooding to collect fish and trap it. That has been very important for protein in Amazonia. And all these forest patches, elevated mounds, a whole system that takes a landscape and makes it habitable, but in a way that works with nature and enhances nature rather than in a way that completely destroys it. And we have geoglyphs, and they're being mapped, and the density and the amount of geoglyphs that are being mapped is mind-boggling. This is in Acre, where Brazilian archaeologist Eduardo Neves, who had the courtesy of sharing with me all these images, is working right now. And you see they're emerging everywhere, the signs of settlement. And we know through the chronicles, and we know through the missionaries who describe this, that Amazonia was had huge populations that died off, like most of the Amerindians in the 16th century and 17th and 18th century from viruses. 90% of them, pandemics like the one we're suffering right now. But imagine, we're suffering 10% death rates in different countries. This was a 90% genocide. And this is in my country. We knew that there was something in the Rio Upano, in the Upano River, but we never imagined. Look at the way, you know, we see it now. We never imagined that this is what LiDAR was going to show us. And of course, this LiDAR image was created due to gold survey necessities. LiDAR images are extremely expensive, but the government is willing to fund them, not for archaeological purposes, but for extractive purposes. And it's amazing to me that in our search for more wealth, more gold, more oil, more copper, what we are finding is the voices of ancestral Amazonians that are coming out to the surface to give us a very big lesson on how we can not just live with the forest, as we say, but actually procure forest, make forest, be forest as, you know, a culture. The message is amazing, and for me, it's beautiful because it gives me hope back. And I've been reading the work of Canciano Amico, an architect and archaeologist in Peru, who has been studying the cultural landscapes of Peru for decades. And this is what we're finding out. I mean, look at that textile. It is unbelievable. And the way he interprets it is that he says this was scripted for the gods. As I told you, these are spiritual landscapes. And here as well, you know, within our ontology of the way we understand everything through the lens of this sacralized and disenchanted nature that's separate from the human, the description has been that this was a laboratory. We use the word laboratory for agriculture created by the Incas. And he's saying, no, it's not a laboratory. That this is not the ontology. We cannot project our own ontology into the Inca ontology. This is about the connection of the underworld and the upper world. There's this continuous connection between the skies and the land that ancient cultures in the Americas, as they settled, always emphasized. And I could go on, but right now, for the sake of time, just observe the immense ability. These were master landscape architects. And this,
Ana
you know,
Maria?
this is obviously even a state.
Ana Maria, maybe
productive.
you
Oh,
could
I need to
run
finish.
those slides while we prepare for
Okay,
a sort of larger conversation, okay?
perfect. So I'll
Great.
stop there and I'll show you some more if there's time.
Okay.
Super. Let me stop okay, there.
All right, so if all the speakers are visible. Now, if people will put questions in the chat, I'm gonna start with a question so that there's a conversation while people are figuring out how to frame what they wanna ask. And I think something that we haven't really done much in the previous conversations, I also wanna open it up to the speakers to ask questions of each other. So if you could all unmute so you're ready to talk, that would be great. And I'm going to start with a bit of a chaotic question that sort of I began thinking of when I read your synopses or abstracts, just so I would be prepared. And now I've sort of had more thoughts on it. So it's going to be a little unwieldy. But I think that obviously you're all trying to book authority. And that can be a kind of punk spectacle or a slow process of erosion wearing down. And I think you all sort of run the gamut in different ways of taking that on, from Liz Berry's, you know, the volume of her discourse and the marches, you know, to the kind of accretive documentary that Matthew Seibert's looking at. But I think that I'd like to hear you speak about a bit about the mechanisms that you imagine to be necessary to provoke the wholesale change. So what's really going to do in the idea that, you know, we're going to come up with a master plan that's going to solve a city's problems? What's really going to, you know, undermine the authority of the Army Corps and their capacity to keep running roughshod over communities? And certainly, you know, with Liz and Ana Maria, how do we get out of this epistocracy, as you frame it, and start, you know, revaluing? These are big asks. And I see a lot of connections between your presentations, more connections than differences, really. You're all dealing with some degree of reflection, spanning Ana Maria's looking back into the ancient past, to Julia's looking at the, you know, 30 years ago when we started talking about, you know, opening up our ideas of planning, and Matthew Seibert, you know, digging up really the documents from the last century, 100 years ago, a little less than 100 years ago. And Liz is talking about right now, but she's also talking about the history of science, which, you know, and the structures which go back to the 19th century. So she's really reflecting back. So you've got all of this deep history and thought. And what you really want to say is something that's going to grab our attention immediately, whether it's through branding or an aerial image that's evocative of transformation. But now I'm going to put you on the spot. How do you really think this can happen? If we're going to be optimistic, how are we really going to leverage change? What's the time span you're thinking of? And I'll start with whoever wants to speak first. And if nobody jumps in, I'll call on Julia because she spoke first.
You just muted yourself, Julia.
I think that was intentional.
Oh, okay. First of all, amazing presentations. I wish you guys could each, I'll just invite you to Syracuse and you'll give a nice long lecture. So thank you for that, Denise. But, you know, I have to say that if we're confronted with places of disinvestment, then working incrementally has a lot of potential, meaning that when we started working this way, some colleagues in landscape architecture, when I would lecture about this work, would ask me, gosh, Julia, if you didn't have to work this way, would you? I mean, wouldn't you rather just like do it? And I remember thinking that the answer was absolutely not, right? Because we were actually driven initially by a complete lack of resources and a community that felt incredibly disengaged. I think it spurred the innovation that drove some of our tactics. So they weren't really coming from, sadly, I wish I could say it, they weren't coming from a position of saying, we're going to kill this zombie idea. It came from the context in which we work. And this was, you know, the Upstate Institute. We were talking about formerly urban cities, very different than working, you know, in cities in China, the kind of fast urbanism. And so I think through that process, we began to see that this had agency in other conditions. So yeah, I mean, I think it was kind of backwards, the coming into being of it. And I think that given the state of so many cities in this country specifically, you know, I think it has legs.
I mean, I think that's a really great question, Denise. I mean, I definitely don't know the answer. So I'll just preface it with that. But I guess for my project, which in a lot of ways was originally more about just, I don't know, design in a conventional sense, but then working through archives and historical material and using history as a medium sort of brought on all these sort of new insights. But I mean, I think the best way to answer the question with respect to kind of history and this idea of for wholesale change is just how we teach history and how we define history. And that's certainly not a quick sort of solution. I think it's a generational project. I mean, obviously, I'm saying that history shouldn't be sort of understood as this sort of absolute that is sort of determined by the people in power. But it's much more of a sort of fluid process between the recorder of those historical facts, the historian, the reader of the history. So there's a certain sort of fluidity in a relationship between sort of the present when history is written versus sort of the past, what it's kind of talking about. And so ultimately, it's how to kind of engage with history as a method of inquiry, essentially, right? That that we when we present history, we present it through, in a lot of ways, we present it through the historian's eyes first. So we kind of understand where the history is coming from, what prejudices, what sort of motives, what history are they coming from that they're sort of pulling from a personal level, right? So I think it's really important just when we present these histories to engage with how where it came from and how it was written, right? And so I mean, I think that's one larger idea. I think the other idea is that once we sort of understand that, and once we begin to sort of see history as a bit more kind of malleable, which obviously carries some respective dangers, but I was really sort of interested in our process when we begin to sort of make contacts in the community, that just our interest in kind of what happened actually triggered their interest in their past that they had essentially sort of forgotten in a way. So they began to actually look into archives that they had. For instance, the church I showed you, Mount Zion Baptist Church, they ended up, they had sort of forgotten about this, but ended up looking into their materials and found record of the Army Corps' disinterring their cemetery from the floodway and reinterring them in this new site sort of outside the floodway. And so it's also this sort of access to the past that I think is really interesting, and the sort of willingness to forget. And I think once we begin to sort of understand history as more of a process rather than sort of this universal reality, it has ramifications in a number of different realms, from researchers to actual local citizens to kind of the larger population.
I think that's a great segue into the issues that Liz is dealing with in talking about kind of a rejection of professionalized science, because in many ways, the idea of history as truthful has already been taken out of the hands of historians and pushed into popular media, which we were talking about a little bit before this started. And I think that certainly that's happened with science, but it's a double-edged sword that you're sort of dancing around. And Liz, you're really dancing around.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up professionalization, because that wherever we're going, we'll get to a better place faster if professionals don't show up and be like, I got this, when these problems are wicked, cross-domain, and ultimately political rather than scientific. Even a lot where I was going in my presentation was hoping that landscape architects, that land managers, that stewards might recognize in themselves in the terrain of inquiry I put forward, and might come to appreciate their non-professional empiricism as absolutely vital for self-determination. And then, yeah, like little thin bridges may come out, and like you may get that photograph that holds that company accountable. You may make that map that proves your land tenure in the Amazon, like digital democracy is doing so incredibly. But that the inquiry matters, and it matters that you're the one looking. And that's what science eliminated modern science has eliminated for too long. So I would point that way. Thanks.
Anna Maria, you wanna talk about how you're
Something.
carry forward?
I mean, as I was listening to the three of you, I was just taking some notes in terms of, because we do need to respond, not just
Yeah,
remain stuck in the problems that completely have been overwhelming us for decades. But I would say that I fully agree with Liz in terms of like, we need to abandon technocratic models of planning and development, which right now, unfortunately, are run by banks. I don't think that financial institutions should be planning my country, to be honest with you. It drives me nuts. But it is the World Bank, the IMF, and others, some of them are regional, like CAF. Why are financial institutions planning the territory? I don't get it. And then we need to abandon these technocracies that come with answers and international development theories and focus on local planning, local knowledge. I think that in the case of Latin America, but not just Latin America, the world, we need to, another zombie, agribusiness. No, thank you. Bye, go. We need to go back to agroecology. We're putting our food security at stake in the name of progress and development, knowing that in 15, 20 years, the lands are depleted. I don't know, how we can be so shameless about these things, because we have the scientific knowledge that shows us that these systems are toxic and stem from Second World War technologies that were designed to kill, not to nurture life. And then, so agroecology, I think, is vital for the future. I think that in the case of the so-called third world countries, and this is political, as Liz was mentioning, the pity is that it's not, even if you want to, sometimes they just don't let you, because somebody else wants to control the resources and the elites of your country as well. But we need to shift from export-driven economies to regional economies. And I think that with the pandemic, to me, this has become an obsession in the sense that it's non-negotiable. Cities like Guayaquil that have subjected their whole hinterland to shrimp and banana farms could not feed themselves in the pandemic because they're completely dependent for food on other regions of Ecuador, like the highlands. So then you wonder, why is the city subjugating its whole hinterlands to export, to two export commodities like bananas and shrimp, and maybe oil palm now, and putting its own food security at stake in the name of what? So I think that we need to be also very, very adamant about abandoning export-driven economic development models, which are taught in schools. Sorry, but I think I also added academia needs to revamp itself. urgently from all perspectives, because these are students of economy that are learning that this is a fantastic system, that there's no better alternative, and that we need to, convince everyone that this is the way to go, that the economy should be export driven, because that's the way to make billions of dollars, and that's the way to extract yourself, as Michael Sorkin used to say, extraction to extract yourself out of poverty, but it doesn't happen. You remain as indebted or more indebted, poor, and with environmental externalities that you can't handle, and that have completely eliminated all the social tissues and the community tissues that allowed some people to at least have a sustenance. A Waurani in the Amazon, like the Monte Nenquimos family, was not poor, even though the World Bank would categorize them as poor because they don't make more than what, $152 per day. But they're not poor. Wauranis living the Waurani life are not poor. They eat very well. They have their great medicinal systems, their construction systems. So I feel that we're going through a moment of history in which we really need to shift our ontology in everything. But the economy, the political economy, is the one thing that we don't want to touch when we discuss the green economy. We don't want to touch it. I don't know why it's so hard to touch it, but that is the problem. So we need to think about economy in a different way. And I'm thinking, go back to community-based development. Why is my government not transferring funds to communities directly for community-based projects? All sorts of projects. Communities have ideas. They don't need experts. They have the empirical knowledge that Liz mentioned, but they do need resources. For example, there's a community in Ecuadorian Amazonia, the Sinchiwarmi. It's a community of women, actually, women who have been suffering from domestic violence and who've had it and started their own matriarchy, if you wish. And they're like, we would love to buy these lands that ranchers abandoned after they've used them up, and now there's nothing on them, but we know how to reforest them. But we don't have the $15,000 to buy these, 50 hectares. Why is the government not helping these communities with projects that are so evidently beneficial? The oil companies are not going to do the cleanup. They're not going to reforest.
Well, in many cases,
So
the government
I just think that,
in many cases, the government isn't stepping in because of corruption. I think that there's ladders of issues here. But to bring it back into the realm where, we might have some agency, there's a question in the chat about how's the way we educate for disciplinarity play into the leading and advocating for these changes. And I think, Ana Maria, you sort of touched on that with the idea that maybe the economists need to learn some ecology. How might the idea of bodies of knowledge be reframed in a different future that takes a broader view of knowledge sources and narratives? Is there a role for deep knowledge that still allows for alternative knowledges? So can the academy actually take on a more generous view of knowledge generation? Or does that concept actually challenge the very idea of an academy? In which case we've got a really big zombie we have to kill. We are it.
We'll all be out of jobs.
So let's put that one on the back burner and talk about how we might restructure what it is we teach, so that some of these ideas of crossing disciplines and awarenesses might start to leach into things. And I'll just add an aside that I've been looking at the last publication, one of the last publications Michael Sorkin was working on before he died, and a massive chunk of the introduction to it is basically a treatise on modern economics. And it was amazing, and I had to go back and learn an awful lot in order to just even to proofread it. But I think that this idea that we need to, as designers, we're always talking about transdisciplinarity, but maybe it's not just crossing design disciplines. Maybe we need to be crossing many other bigger disciplines, and the idea of what a team is needs to change. So maybe, people, I know all of you are engaged in academia because I've all met you in academic format. So why doesn't somebody jump in? Matthew, your mic is on. You win.
I thought we were supposed to keep our mics on so we could pipe up. I get punished for following the rules.
You get punished for following the rules, yeah.
I mean, it's tough. I mean, obviously, these questions are being posed because answers aren't really easy. Though I am a little. I suspect Thaisa might have some better answers for these than myself. But I think they're really important. Yeah, I mean, how we educate for disciplinarity and how that sort of plays into advocating for change. And yeah, Denise kind of thinking about yeah, the academy as as a target in a lot of ways. I mean, speaking from the discipline of landscape architecture, both as kind of as a student, a grad student, and then yeah, now teaching. I guess I'm continually and increasingly kind of troubled how we teach history, and what history we teach. Again, because it's oftentimes the sort of usual canon. It's usually sort of the white male European aristocrat, right? And we very rarely does sort of core history classes kind of get into I don't know, more sort of a contemporary sort of setting. And I think that I mean, it's there's issues there because as I think this whole kind of conference or whatever we want to call this has shown is that um, landscape and culture, I mean, ecology and sort of society can't be sort of separated. And any design that we work with, propose, etc., has to kind of understand that and understand the history of the site we're kind of going through, and not that it's purely just this thing to catalog, as I think Thaisa has said in the past, as like a timeline, but it's actually it's much more important than that, to understand what that history is kind of telling you about the relationship between the people in place. And so, I mean, I would really love to see core history curriculums in landscape architecture take a very different sort of approach. I mean, Kofi Boone recently wrote about Black landscapes and places journal, and he was kind of talking about a sort of a people's history of kind of Black landscapes, or I think he says that a bit differently, but beginning to just sort of redefine kind of how what are the historical landscapes that we should kind of know about, what are the kind of narratives and histories and stories that go along with that. For instance, I mean, I think the Army Corps of Engineers should play a huge, or have a very sort of featured point in the curriculum as far as landscape architecture and sort of the design of landscapes. And so I guess I would just like to see us kind of rethink the sort of conventional canon of historical landscapes we teach. I think it's a start, at least.
Seems like low-hanging fruit. What about anybody
yeah,
else?
though it's embedded. It's very embedded. So
yeah, no, it is. I mean, we reorganized our curriculum and took out the chronologic, uncovering of landscape production and changed it into a thematic course, and that took years to effect because of resistance to that kind of change. The idea that you have to know everything rather than know how to think about things often intrudes. So what about Julia or Liz or Anna Maria? Any more thoughts?
I just think that, I have a lot of optimism about, I guess I'm filled with optimism, about the next generation. I mean, our students, those that are on this journey of education with us, are sort of demanding alternative narratives. They're not going to, I mean, at Syracuse, it's that history of teaching design was based largely on narratives and precedent of, Western European buildings. And, our students just won't look at that stuff anymore. It's not okay. And so, and certainly our junior faculty are bringing a completely different worldviews to the table. And so it's slow, but I'm certainly seeing a shift in just how and what is being taught.
Right. Yeah.
I would say I'm going to be optimistic about academia just because I love my studies. Yeah, what I don't like is industry. Sometime over a drink, I'd love to tell you the line that broke my heart during my time at Skidmore, Owings and Merrill.
You have to tell us now.
Yeah, really. You're on the hook.
I'd say, you know, we're not stuck, you know, servicing capital, this profession of ours. We can work in different ways. We can find new economies. We can be part of a solidarity economy. You know, if we didn't think that our expertise keeps us apart from people who live closer to the land or who don't get paid as much hourly. I started a nonprofit 10 years ago. You know who paid for it? It was the journalism industry. They're like, we need environmental information. And I think our profession, you know, we stand in the middle. When are we farther from a scientist? When we're standing on a brand new site we've never been to. And
Right.
I feel like that we have an orientation to inquiry that's adjacent to many other domains. So I just think we should get really creative about moving money around the way we practice. And I would also just make a point that, you know, a few years ago, it was, you know, our designers, facilitators, like, is that an equal sign there? And I would just say, just get another get an actual facilitator so that you can be you. And that you don't have to both be you, but also try to level the playing field. Because laying the playing field of interaction is both at the heart of empirical breakthroughs. So you can get out of your frame of references so that people's frames of references can combine. And it's also the heart of some of the fastest moving political change. If anyone's seen citizens' assemblies trending right now, to get out of polarization, to get out of the fact that politicians can't make politically unpopular decisions, move deliberation into a civic lottery, stratified, and let people come into relationship with each other. Facilitators are working there, emergence is working there. So can landscape architecture find a crucible to emerge with other people? Check.
So that's an interesting thing. What you're not suggesting that we, you know, get rid of design and authorship. What you're saying is we need a mediator between the people we think we're working for and ourselves, and that's a kind of new arena of knowledge, a new approach. It would require a kind of different set of skills and understandings. I think that's a fascinating idea. Certainly not somebody with a business degree, as I think Anna Maria is about to say.
No, I was just going to say that listening again to the three of you, but I agree with the comment on history. I'm doing a seminar on the history of pre-Columbian cities right now here at Yale, and I feel very lucky to have had this opportunity. I've been inviting lots of Native Americans to talk to us as well as archaeologists. In the course, it's mainly those two groups. But I was thinking about the issue of politics, which I also feel is in flux, undergoing radical shifts. And I like the way in which it's heading, because I don't think we're discussing right versus left anymore, even though so many people in my generation insist in wedging the conversation into this polarization between left and right, especially in Latin America. Although in the US, I've seen an analogous process happening lately, which shocks me. Because from the perspective of Latin America, the US is right. There's no left here. But in Latin America, it's always like right, left, you know, this completely polarized idea that we need to pick between the two. But I think that what is at stake right now is that industrial revolution conversation of who controls the immense power that was unleashed by capital and industry, the nation state, which leads into communism, or the private sector, which leads into corporatism. I think that the new generation has had it with both, because from the perspective of the ground, from the perspective of gender, from the perspective of the territory, from the perspective of what I feel the new generation really cares about. They're about environmental politics, gender politics, and politics of social equity. From that perspective, neither right nor left have provided any particularly satisfying answers.
But why do we need the
And
binary?
I feel that there's also this information that is political. We don't need it. I think it's been completely deconstructed by the youth that Julia was mentioning, that they're changing everything. They have a very different way of thinking about things. I see my generation stuck in that conversation, which bores me to death, because I think politics are not about that anymore. Climate change is not about right or left. It's suicidal to think it's about, climate change is climate change. That's it. It's a different type of politics. And I find that exciting and liberating, to be honest, being a child of the Cold War.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a great way to end. We're out of time, and to take this forward, that maybe the optimistic thing to wonder about is that whatever we've been doing in academia and with professionalization, there is a generation out there that is rejecting binaries of all kinds. Now, whether it sticks or whether as they age, they grow to love their binaries, who knows? But at least at the moment, there is this idea of both and, as opposed to either or, that I think is really compelling. And I want to thank great speakers and wonderful conversationalists, and some Thaisa Wei, who put some really great questions in the chat box. And thanks to everybody who's participated in this, and certainly if you've joined us for all 4 of these, congratulations and thank you.
It was a lot of fun, Denise. Thank you for organizing.
Well, I just want to say again that this is a team effort, that it's not just me. It is Andrea Parker, Erica Svensson, and Lindsay Campbell, that we had many actual meetings in person, which seems a lifetime ago, planning the conference for last spring that got zapped by COVID. And so then we spent the summer putting this series together. But this is definitely a collaborative effort. And I think it speaks to the way we're thinking about the way all of this discourse needs to move forward, as not being univocal, as somebody said. I love that term, univocal.
Isn't it a great word? It's a great word.
Yeah.
Assemblage, 1989.
Okay, thank you. Can you email me that?
I will.
All right, thank you. All right, so thanks again, everybody, and good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, Denise.